Well, as you probably learned in elementary school, verbs are very important. But don't worry, we're not going to be conjugating sentences or doing anything from English class. We're going to be talking about verbs in the context of SOA exam questions. And these are critical to understand. This is a critical skill for passing the exam, is simply understanding the verbs that appear in each and every question that you will have to answer on the exam. And so in this video series, we're going to cover the 4 cognitive levels of verbs used by the SOA. We'll discuss the major verbs at each of those cognitive levels. We'll look at a distribution of verbs in what you might call an experience study that I did on the past several sittings of both LPM and LFM exams. In other words, the most recent exams that I have available as of 2021 when I'm recording this video. This will help you get a sense of which verbs appear the most often, and there's some other important takeaways from that analysis that I'll show you. I'll also discuss some trends in questions that involve some sort of calculation, how that has been trending in the last several sittings, and then we'll go into a deeper dive on really understanding how the SOA defines these verbs in their guide to FSA exams. We'll focus on the major verbs when we go through that material, and then I'll walk through a number of specific examples of how verbs have been used in past questions. And don't worry, there shouldn't be any spoilers in here. I've selected past questions that are off the syllabus that date back a number of years, but we'll use those to have a more concrete idea of what I'm talking about. So this is all information, again, that is critical to pass the exam, and hopefully you're watching this video early in your exam prep so you can keep these things in mind as you study the material and certainly as you work practice exams. So first, about those cognitive levels, there are 4 of these, okay? And they kind of go from like simplest to most complex in terms of your cognitive reasoning ability, okay? And so at the bottom end, retrieval, the most basic type of question where you're usually just dumping out a list. People spend a lot of time on memorization and a lot of time memorizing lists, but guess what? That's really never been worth a lot of points on the exams, and in recent sittings, it's been worth even less. Now, before LPM and LFV were created in 2019, 2020, their predecessors, LP and LFV, only saw about 5% retrieval questions, but LPM and LFM, the modern versions of the exams, including the first sitting of CBT, we're only seeing about 3% retrieval now. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The overwhelming majority of points come from either comprehension verbs or analysis verbs that require you to do more than just dump out a list of information. And most of this is weighted in the comprehension level, which I'll define in a moment, but it kind of blurs with the analysis level too. And then the highest level of reasoning, knowledge utilization, is also very important, but even it kind of blurs in with analysis and comprehension. But the key point is that your basic list memorization, regurgitation, is really worth just a very tiny percentage of the total exam. Now, there are lots of verbs that you'll find in the SOA's guide to FSA exams, and I'll say more about that guide later on in this video series, but I wanted to just kind of superimpose what are really the predominant verbs, which I will go into more detail on a number of these in just a moment, but just to kind of superimpose them here and also sort of associate them with their cognitive level. Again, retrieval, really your basic list type question, those don't appear very often, and when they do, it's like a stray 1-point question here and there, okay? Typically not the kind of question that's going to make or even break you on the exam. And identify is sort of your next step up in the cognition level. Takes a little bit more brain power, you might say, to execute and identify question. Now, as you might guess, calculate is a major one, particularly on the LFM exam. This is one of the most dominant verbs of all time. Very clear, whenever you see a calculate verb in a question, you're going to be doing a calculation for sure. Now, historically, describe was also very big. Particularly before LPM and LFM were created, describe was actually more common. Now, it's still fairly common on LFM, but for whatever reason, since they created LPM, as we'll see, describe has kind of trended down a little bit in terms of how often it appears. And describe I've always thought of as like, again, just kind of another step up above list, where you're not just listing something, but you're showing a little bit more comprehension in your answer. But there are a number of others here as you just go up the cognition scale. Critique is probably the single most difficult verb. Okay, if I had to name one verb that represents the most frustrating type of question that can really make or break people on the exam, it's definitely critique. This has become not only more frequent in the last, I would say, 10 years, it has become increasingly frequent on the exams, including the modern exams today. It still appears a lot. And not only does it appear more often, you're also likely to see very high point values attached to critique questions. So that really is a critical one that we'll spend more time on later. But again, this gives you kind of a high-level view of just some very common verbs associated with these cognition levels. So let's take a break now, and in the next video in the course, I'll walk through that verb experience study so you can get a more concrete feel for the frequency and severity of these verbs when they appear on the exams.